Hello, my name is Callie Pettigrew, and I will be sharing my presentation on this topic that we did our research on. So first, we have our introduction, and that is just the Native American music has been racially stereotyped for a few centuries now because of European settlement. The first signs of cultural misappropriation within the Native American community was in 1851 at the World's Fair when people loathed over the interactions of European settlers and Native Americans for the first time. So basically, what that means is that's just whenever the Europeans came over, they were really just kind of like obsessed with all of the Native Americans like rituals and culture, and that is kind of what they like came over to like. They wanted to like Europeanize. I don't know, like they wanted to make the Indians like try to be more like a European way because they were about to move into their land. So, but they were fascinated with the different culture that they did. And then racial slurs used in the music industry were when people began to realize the harm this language was doing against the native people. So that's basically just when people started talking about like, oh, the Indians are on their land and blah blah blah, and they were kind of making fun of them almost because they were like located in one place and they're not going to spread around the United States like all the Europeans had been. They just kind of like started doing that and then using racial slurs against them in the music industry. And that's kind of when people realize like this is a bad thing. So that is what we're going to talk about. So, cultural misappropriation. This phrase is said throughout my paper a lot because it has a strong meaning within this research area. It's basically what this whole thing is talking about. So the meaning from the book is as the intentional theft of tangible or non-tangible culture commodities by an outsider with the intent to be used for economic gain or to intentionally create a stereotype. So this happens when people only want to gain from others' losses, and when Native American music is culturally misappropriated, people tend to make fun of their music or act like they are native or when they're making the songs, which degrades the culture of the Indians. So basically, this is just going to be shown throughout this presentation how people use like the singing and they're going to act like Indians, or whenever they like in the black miss I can't say that word, but whenever they were in the plays and they dressed up like as black people, well, that was the same thing with the Indians. Then people started dressing up as Indians because the black people started to become racial. So then, but Indians were not racial at that time. Whenever they then were like, okay, well, black people, we can't dress up as them, so we can do Indians because they're still, they're Americans. So we came into their land, we can dress up as them. People thought that was okay, but it really wasn't. And then that translated into music by just really making a negative connotation towards a lot of people. So yeah. And then cultural confusion, this is just kind of going along with that. So this is more of when people don't know when to or when to not say something about Native Americans in their song. For instance, in the Tim McGraw song, Indian Outlaw, that was controversial, but he is a full Native. He's half Choctaw, half Cherokee. Um, so technically, in his thought process, he was thinking like, I'm not singing Redface because he is an Indian. But a lot of producers were really hesitant because it was, still considered racially like explicit because he was talking about people in that way. And it just kind of had a bad look on Indians, even though he was Indian, and he lived on their on the reservation. So it was like, it didn't look bad because it was him doing it, but it was also like the negative connotation that came with the song, even though it was a very popular song. And then this is just sometimes confusing because if the native people talk about their culture and heritage, then why can't others? And that's a big topic about, like Native Americans and African Americans, like why can't we talk about it or sing about it? But this is just a sign of disrespect. And in a song, you don't want to have a negative meaning and become racist, because then that's what your song is going to be about. And people aren't going to want to listen to it because, no one wants to listen to a racist song. So, singing red face is when a non native person sings the character of an Indian and takes on the racial stereotypes. And this is kind of what I was talking about before. In the 20th century, Disney began to integrate more Indians into their musicals because it was more socially acceptable. So that was kind of after the Blacks were not as culturally appropriate to be dressed up as in the musical. So then they started doing Indians because they thought that was a little bit more like we can still dress as them, because the Western movies, like everyone loved those, like cowboys and Indians. Like that's okay. There's just people fighting. It's not slaves. They were free. So that's kind of how they thought it was okay. But people began playing Indians more. So this was somewhat of the rise in culturally acceptable for Indians being character. An example is in Peter Pan, the Indians were idealized because they helped Peter, and so Peter became an Indian. And that made little kids want to dress up as Indians as their Halloween costume, or just, it idealized them because Peter got an Indian name. So people, little kids, they're so impressionable. They were probably like, oh, I want an Indian name too. Like, that sounds cool. So that was just kind of a little like, I don't know. It was kind of the start of some controversy there. Racial and antipathy in the book, I looked this up. This was one of my sources, and it just stated that it's hatred, hostility, or bigotry directed toward a group or one of its members on account of their race. So this is a perfect example of how the Native Americans were and are still being treated as people. um, think of them as outcasts on the tribal land. So basically, like in Oklahoma, we still have reservations, right? But people don't think that. Like, so I'm from Kentucky, and people are like I said something about like, yeah, an Indian reservation. One of my friends lives on one, and she was doing her final on it. And when there was COVID and she didn't have Wi-Fi, so she had to go to like the main center because like her actual house didn't have Wi-Fi on the reservation. And just the stuff like that. Like people think that that's like an outcast. Like that's just like they're gonna not think that that group should be accounted for as like the American society, because they're and they're going to fight against us there, because when the US tries to take some of their territory, they're going to fight back. Well, of course they are. That's their reservation, but then they look hostile and all of that. So one thing that is usually not considered when people think of the Indian giver, which is that Indians give and expect to return for what they gave, is that when Lewis and Clark came to North America, they didn't understand the trading process. And so basically, the Indians gave Lewis and Clark a gift, and in their trading process, they expected Lewis and Clark to give them something back, but they didn't because they thought it was just a gift for welcoming. And this just ties back to racial at antipathy, because after this interaction, there was a negative stereotype about this word and Indians as they were not gracious or giving. So that was just kind of um, the Indian giver. And then lastly, idealized sympathy. This is in the songs that feature idealized sympathy or sympathy for an imagery Native American character caricature, that the issue of voice appropriation and misrepresentation become clearly visible. The song Indian Reservation which was wrote by John D. Loudermilk, was one of the first songs to show this controversial with the different interpretations of the lyrics when people began to sing it. Marvin Rainwater sang this song but renamed it the Paleface Indian to show a negative meaning towards the song. Then Don Fardin covered this song in the late 60s. This is when the song really took off. And thankfully, he had changed the meaning and the name back to the Indian reservation, but it still shows that some people can sing about their native culture without being native themselves, because Marvin Rainwater was native, so technically he wasn't singing um, Red Face because he was, even though he was the one singing negatively about it. But Don Fardin turned it around to be a positive, and he was singing Red Face, but he was trying to turn it around. So it's just kind of a controversy there. But that is all I have for this presentation. So I hope you learned what my research paper was about.